I'm glad you're all here. We are here to talk about trauma and what trauma is, what it looks like, what it feels like, and what we as people of faith and the Methodist Church need to know about trauma, and then how that knowledge can inform how we do ministry in our local congregations and in relationship with one another. So we'll keep going. There we go. Things are working, well, knock on wood, things are working tech-wise. Let's see if they continue to. My name's Carrie Smith-Gaylord. I am a licensed clinical social worker in North Carolina. I have a small private practice where I work with people, mostly parents, who are working on untangling the ways that their childhoods affect how they parent. So I work a lot with people who became parents and realized, oh, wow, I'm yelling more than I thought I would, or I feel a lot more apathetic about this whole parenting thing. I'm having trouble engaging with my children. I don't know how to feel my feelings when my kids are feeling their really big feelings. And as part of that, I do a lot of work around trauma. I've been practicing for over a decade, and almost all of that time has been working with either children or adults who have experienced trauma, which is why I'm talking about trauma today. I'm also a lifelong United Methodist. My family joined the Methodist Church in North Florida, where I grew up when I was a small child. And I went to a Methodist college. And then much later, I married a guy who's a Methodist pastor. And so I'm also a clergy spouse here in the Western North Carolina Conference. And Jonathan, my husband, is actually doing, he's the guy on here who says, tech help, Jonathan. So he is producing for our session tonight. So he will be making sure that, there he is. Hey, John. He'll be here to make sure that if we run into any tech stuff, he'll take care of us. I want you to know that our session is being recorded, so that it can be posted later on to the conference website. If you don't mind, while we're meeting tonight, please stay on mute. That way, the people who are participating with you can hear what they're trying to hear. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them. If there's a question and answer box, put them in that. I don't actually know if there is. If not, just throw them in the chat and I will kind of break periodically or try to break, or John will send me questions as they come up, and I will do my darndest to make sure that we leave. Oh, look, it's up at the top. Thanks, John. I will do my darndest to make sure that we have plenty of time at the end to be in community and answer questions with one another. And if you do not mind, I'd like to open with blessing. So will you pray with me? God of daily resurrection, who is always renewing, creating, keep us moving forward with you towards wholeness. When we feel defeated, turn us towards your hope. When we feel alone, remind us of your presence. When we are angry, center us in gratitude. Amen. So we are going to spend some time doing a couple of things tonight. First, we are going to define, I don't know if this is the one you signed up for, Michelle. First, we are going to define what trauma is. Then we are going to talk a little bit about different kinds of trauma, including spiritual trauma. Then we're going to talk about how trauma shows up in our bodies and what some common trauma symptoms may be. We'll move into what to do if you or someone you love is displaying signs of trauma. And then from there, we will move into how to create trauma-informed churches, how to create churches that are safe places for people who may have experienced trauma, including the trauma of disaffiliation. If you have any questions, again, please pop them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. So I think it's important as we get started to clarify some terms and make sure that we're on the same page. Primarily, I want to make sure that we know what we're talking about when we say trauma. When I say trauma, I mean something that happened in the past that creates significant hardship or impairment in the present. Trauma comes from the Latin word meaning wound. And in medicine, in the practice of physical medicine, we think of a trauma as physical damage to a body part. In psychological or emotional trauma, we think of damage, pain, suffering that has happened and has created emotional damage. It's important for us to remember that trauma is subjective. It's not necessarily the circumstances of an event that determine whether or not it's traumatic for someone. It's how someone feels or remembers or experienced that potentially traumatic event. So something that was traumatic for Jill may not be traumatic for Susie. Something that's traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you, even if we experienced the exact same thing. Very frequently, when somebody experiences an event that feels out of their control, when they feel helpless or overwhelmed or scared during the event, it's more likely to be traumatic. We often think of trauma in the classic diagnostic sense. If I were looking to diagnose somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder, we would look for an event that threatened our life or safety. However, it's important for us to remember that for our purposes today, trauma doesn't necessarily mean something that involves physical harm or threat to your body. It's more a threat to your personhood. We'll get into that more in a minute. It's important to remember that trauma is not a diagnosis. I think frequently we hear this kind of colloquially where somebody will say, I have trauma. And certainly we can say that and it can be experienced that way. However, trauma is not a diagnosis. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnosis. There are a lot of other diagnoses that may have their roots in a traumatic experience, but trauma is the act of or the experience that happened to somebody. As a sort of aside, but I think it's interesting. I hope you do too. I am always struck with how young the recognition of trauma as significant emotional difficulty following a life interfering or life threatening or ego threatening act is. It wasn't until the 1980s that trauma was recognized as something that creates significant emotional difficulty. So trauma is, less than 40 years old, which is the idea of trauma as a medically recognized event is less than 40 years old, which is just wild to me every time I think about it. I think that my favorite definition of trauma is when something happened that shouldn't have happened, or when something didn't happen that should have happened. Let's flip to my next slide. Here we go. For the purposes of our time together today, we're going to talk about two kinds of trauma primarily. Big T trauma, over there on the orange side of the screen, capital T trauma, which would be a situation that's kind of classically or historically recognized as traumatic, something where your life or a loved one's life is threatened, their bodily integrity is threatened. Those are the things we think of when we think of trauma, when we think of people who are veterans of a war, who have experienced war, car accidents, dog bites, traumatic childbirth, medical or hospitalization experience. The things where we thought we might die would be those big T traumas. Little T traumas are events that exceed our capacity to cope and cause a distress or disruption in emotional functioning. I like to think of little T traumas as things that disrupt our ego. And by ego, I don't mean like we think highly of ourselves. I mean our identity, kind of things that disrupt our understanding of who we are as people, and whose feelings of safety in the world are changed because of an event or a series of events. Small t traumas often leave us feeling unloved or unsafe or helpless in some way. So when I think of small t trauma, I think of being a victim of bullying, experiencing infidelity in a relationship, or a breakup with a friend, where maybe your actual life or physical being isn't threatened, but it sure feels like your identity is different after than before. One way to think of trauma is as the events in our life where we can clearly recognize a before and an after. Small t traumas often appear on the surface to be of very little importance, but can have a significant, enduring impact. And frequently, those of us who have experienced a small t trauma may try to rationalize the experience as common and kind of discredit our own experience, to feel shame maybe about our experience and say we're being dramatic or we're overreacting to how deeply this experience has wounded us. I think that when we do that, we do ourselves a tremendous, tremendous disservice. People respond differently to potentially traumatic experiences, and I think this is really important to remember. Traumatic experiences can elicit a wide range of responses, and not everyone is going to react the same. And it's important to remember that there is a cumulative effect to trauma. Let's see if my screen can catch up to me. What I mean by that is when somebody has experienced one trauma, their recovery after that is more likely, not always, but is more likely to be straightforward. When somebody has experienced multiple disruptions, multiple traumatic experiences, the way it impacts us in our lives becomes greater. I would suggest that over the past several years in the United Methodist Church, we have experienced cumulative small t traumas to include the COVID-19 pandemic, when so many of us were away from our worshiping communities for a long period of time, not to mention the conflict and discord that happened in those communities over when it was safe to go back to church and when it wasn't safe to go back to church, and if getting vaccinated was the right choice and if it wasn't. There was a lot going on around COVID-19. And during this time, starting before COVID, but during this time, disaffiliation kind of came to a peak in the United Methodist Church, not to mention the broader socio-political landscape that we live in the United States, where it can feel almost impossible sometimes to have a conversation with somebody you disagree with in a way that feels loving, because we've so many of us have retreated to our camps and are having trouble hearing and listening empathetically to people around us. And so I'm suggesting here today, and in any conversation I have with basically anyone, that this combination of cumulative small t traumas, for some of us, COVID was also a big t trauma, has created an overwhelming sense of unease in our beings, in our bodies, in our spirits, in our emotional lives. Let's talk a little bit about how that shows up for us. So we're going to talk a little bit about how your body responds to trauma. It's important to remember when we're talking about this that your brain is part of your body. We forget that sometimes. I think when we talk about our bodies, we tend to think of like our arms and our legs and our stomachs and our hearts. But in fact, your brain, part of your body, critical, important part of your body. All trauma symptoms are functional adaptations for protection. What I mean by that is symptoms that we may experience after a trauma are there to protect us. I'm going to give you an illustration of that. If you can imagine with me for a moment that you are a cave person millennia ago, and you're out, I don't know, hunting or gathering or doing whatever it is the cave people did one day, and all of a sudden you hear limbs cracking and a tremendous roar, and you look up and you see a saber-toothed tiger. This is when my 5-year-old would interrupt me and say, "No, Mom, it's a saber-toothed cat, not a saber-toothed tiger." So we see a saber-toothed tiger, and immediately what happens in your body? Your heart starts to race. your muscles activate, your breathing changes so that you can run as fast as you can back to your dwelling, your cave, and get safe, right? So let's say that you're pretty speedy and you make it all the way back to your safe dwelling, and then you get back. If your body returns to baseline, then you are not having a maladaptive trauma response. If after, from the physical exertion of running back, your heart rate slows down, your muscles relax, your brain you're able to think about things other than the immediate threat, then your body is functioning the way that it is supposed to when it's functioning in a healthy way. Trauma symptoms are helpful while you're under threat. The blood pumping sends more oxygenated blood to your muscles so you can run faster and fight harder. Your stomach temporarily stops digesting to preserve energy to be used for other functions that are necessary to keep you safe, which is why people get stomach aches when we're stressed and our nervous systems are activated. Our brains become laser focused on getting safe. Those are good things when you're in danger. We've all heard the story of the mom who lifted the Buick to save her kid, right? Those are trauma responses that are supposed to happen to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe. What happens in your body when this is happening, when you experience something that sends you into that feels like it could threaten your life or the safety of yourself or someone you love, your limbic system in your brain is activated. It turns on the sympathetic nervous system in your body, which is like the fire alarm for your body. So all non-essential systems like rest and digestion, it's always a hard word for me to say, digestion and sleep, turn off, and your body's flooded with stress hormones like cortisol, so you can prepare to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which is another way to say people please, which is a newer trauma response that we're learning more. Well, it's not newer in the sense that it's happening now and didn't used to happen, but it's one that we consider a trauma response now. So I'm going to say those again because I think they're important. Fight the thing that's hurting you. Flight, run away from the thing that's hurting you. Freeze, stop moving so that you're not noticed by the thing that wants to hurt you. And fawn, or people please. Try to get the thing, the person, the system that is hurting you to think more of you. They'll think that you are nice or good so that it does not hurt you anymore. So those are all good things to happen. Ideally, what then happens once the threat has passed is your parasympathetic nervous system activates, and all of those things go in reverse. So if your sympathetic nervous system is the gas, your parasympathetic nervous system is the brakes. You pump the brakes, your digestion returns, your ability to sleep again comes back, you can be still in your body, you're not looking around you for threat or danger. For folks without a maladaptive response to trauma, you return to normal, baseline normal. Your cognitive function returns. You can go back to your day with relatively few side effects. Maybe you'll feel jittery for a while, have some of that adrenaline coursing through your body, but it will dissipate. For people who live with complex trauma, for people who have experienced major traumas or have experienced multiple cumulative traumas throughout their life, who no longer have a functional response to trauma, who maybe have a maladaptive response to trauma, their limbic system stays engaged almost all of the time. This is a coping mechanism to help them try and stay safe in the face of ongoing adversity, but it's the experience of constantly being in survival mode or on edge. We recognize this as hypervigilance. If you've ever worked with small children, I think interestingly, this can look a lot like ADHD, and the two are very frequently confused. But if you've ever been in an elementary school classroom and seen a kid doing this, looking everywhere, having trouble sitting still, it could be ADHD, maybe they have to go to the restroom, but it could also be hypervigilance. We may also know people in our lives who cannot sit in a restaurant if they're not facing the door. That could be a symptom of hypervigilance, needing to be constantly on alert or aware of what's going on. In our churches, it can look like difficulty being still, difficulty sinking into times of prayer and meditation, or constantly, fidgeting, looking around us. What I want you to know is that traumatic events push the nervous system outside of its ability to regulate itself. And for some people, that gets stuck in the on position. And that's when we would describe somebody as having a maladaptive response to trauma. I'm going to check the chat. Yes, exactly, Chris. First responders and military personnel can definitely experience a lot of hypervigilance. That's exactly right. The other one was just John. Okay. Let's keep going. Let's talk a little bit about what this looks like in our body or in our behaviors when we have responses to trauma. Some common physical symptoms or signs of someone having a traumatic response could be pain, body aches, headaches, stomach aches, back aches, heart palpitations or that racing heart, fluttering heart sensation, sweating or perspiration, even when it's not hot or you're not having a hot flash, changes to sleep or appetite or libido, stomach problems like constipation or diarrhea, ease of being startled by touch or unexpected noise, even changes in light can be startling for some people. And I think this is interesting, increased susceptibility to illness. So when we are constantly being flooded with these hormones and chemicals that keep us in a fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, it's a lot of us, you guys, they over time can decrease the effectiveness of our immune system, which means we get sick more often. Emotionally, these responses can look like mood changes to include anxiety and depression, but also labile mood or like rapidly changing mood can look like denial, shock, disbelief, increased need or desire for control, feeling helpless or powerless, shame or guilt, irritability, restlessness, anger, numbing, restricting feelings, apathy, feeling as if you're not really there inside, feeling as if life is happening to you and you're not really participating in it. Along these same emotional sign lines, things like flashbacks, re-experiencing of the potentially traumatic event, panic, nightmares, mood swings, and also I would put under this kind of umbrella destructive coping or addictive behaviors like drinking, gambling, and other high-risk activities. And then finally, we have some social signs that could be common responses to a traumatic event, like relationship issues, avoiding intimacy or increased personal conflicts, feeling as if you can't let people close because the world isn't safe for you and they might try to hurt you again. Or you might get hurt again, withdrawing from others, isolating, difficulty trusting others, worrying about being a burden to other people, minimizing the experience to themselves, like saying it wasn't that bad, or repressing the event, which could look like forgetting. Michelle, it is called flight or fight, or fight or flight, but we've added some more to that. So we've added freeze and fawn. Yep. We can also see other social signs like decreased participation in activities, hobbies, things that used to be enjoyable. I think in our churches, it looks like people not coming to church, people not coming to Bible study or Sunday school, or engaging in the same way when they're there. And then very frequently, people who are having maladaptive responses to trauma may also experience difficulty in school or work or other social activities. Let's talk a little bit about what this looks like specifically for spiritual distress. And I would like to read this quote for you. And to do that, I have to maybe minimize. There we go. I had to see it all. So this is the experience of someone who I understand to be experiencing spiritual distress. And they say, my ability to believe in a loving God is being taken from me. And let me clarify, this person is actually writing about disaffiliation in the United Methodist Church. Piece by piece, step by step, in meeting after meeting as this process continues. Some days I leave the church and feel like God's presence has been beaten out of me. If I feel this way as the minister, I wonder how the average layperson, caught in these seemingly epic struggles for power, biblical clarity, property, and propriety feels. I know because they tell me they feel confused and lost. If any of you are willing, I would love to see your responses of any feelings words that you can think of that apply to your own experience or other people's experiences to disaffiliation in the United Methodist Church in this season. If you can pop those in the chat, I would love to see your thoughts. Oh, Pat, that's so lovely. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Anybody have any thoughts about words they would use to describe what this season of loss of friends, yes, of disaffiliation has felt like? Sadness, loss of friends, numbness, absolutely. I've spoken to a lot of people who have felt lonely. Yeah, rage, disappointment in people we thought we knew, betrayal, maybe even sadness, great sorrow. Yeah, you guys are not alone. I know we've probably all experienced this, and I think that United Methodists across the connection have felt very similarly. Disbelief, I think that's a really important one, Mary John. Like, how could this even happen? Is this real? Yeah, disconnected. Oh, you guys are so right. You're so right. These are lovely ways to describe. Yes. It's really heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking what has happened in our community. And I wonder if for some of you, even, or certainly for people we know, some of those signs and symptoms of trauma that we were mentioning, that I was mentioning before, may feel personal to some of us. So, spiritual trauma is something that is profoundly distressing. It can affect your mental health and the core beliefs that shape your understanding of the world. It often occurs when deeply held spiritual and religious beliefs are challenged. And I think that disaffiliation has been a time for many of us when our core beliefs about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a United Methodist, have been challenged. Very frequently, spiritual trauma can occur, it can be triggered by feeling betrayed by authority figures and institutions. And for so many of us, that has been the feeling during this season of disaffiliation. Spiritual trauma can bring about deep loneliness, as some of you mentioned in the chat, resulting from loss of community, loss of social bonds, and it can even bring about questioning of the very faith that we thought we knew so well. How could God let this happen? How can this loving God that I know and thought I understood a little bit allow people I love to, and allow me to act in such unloving ways towards people that I love? Spirituality and trauma intersect in all kinds of ways, like potentially challenging your trust in the institution of your church, altering your perception of the divine, altering the effectiveness of things like prayer. I've been praying about this. Why is this still happening? Is God not listening to me? Creating a sense of abandonment or disillusionment, a betrayal even by God, disrupting our understanding of our ultimate purpose or meaning of life. It can be uniquely painful. And all of those symptoms that I talked about earlier can occur as the result of spiritual trauma. Spiritual distress can be, I would usually say, a small t trauma that can bring about all of those symptoms. I want to acknowledge there's another phenomenon called moral injury that is not the same as spiritual distress, but I want to acknowledge it because it's different but important. And moral injury is basically the distress that one feels after they have violated what they believe to be their fundamental beliefs. And I do think that this season of disaffiliation has brought about some moral injury for some members of the United Methodist Church who maybe found ourselves acting in ways or being treated in ways, or primarily acting in ways that violated who we thought we were. And we may have some like penance and amends to make because of that. And certainly, I think people, in order to have right relationship, may need to make amends, may need to have other people make amends with us. You're right, Brenda. The spiritual trauma of disaffiliation is not our fault. And I would even go so far as to say that blame may not be helpful when we're talking about spiritual trauma. But it does feel like something that happened to us, not something that we necessarily chose. And that in and of itself is uniquely painful. So let's talk a little bit about what we do to support. Yes, Charles, they could be. They're not necessarily always, but they could be. Let's talk a little bit about what we do to support someone else who has experienced a trauma. Then we're going to talk about what we can do to care for ourselves when we have experienced a trauma. And then we're going to talk about what we can do in our communities to make them safe for somebody who has experienced a trauma, or for people we just don't want to experience a trauma. So when we are supporting someone else who has experienced a trauma, I want you to remember the acronym TALKS. This is not my acronym. I found it, a lot of people use it. I added the S at the end though, so we'll get to that in a minute. The T is simply thank the person for sharing with you. When someone is telling you their story, when they're telling you what they're experiencing, how they're sad, the distress that they're feeling, you say, thank you for sharing this with me. I'm honored that you feel safe enough to share this with me. Then you can ask them, what would be helpful? Thank you for sharing this with me. Are there any ways that come to mind that I can support you during this time? It sounds really hard. Keep in mind, they might not know. They might not know what you can do to help them, but they also might, and it's worth asking because we are all the expert of our own experience. The L in TALKS is listen non-judgmentally. What I mean by that is we are not here to decide right or wrong for them. We are not here to decide if what they're experiencing makes sense or if it doesn't make sense. When we are supporting someone else through any emotional difficulty, especially through something that is the result of trauma, our response is simply to believe them. We are not the judge. We are not the jury. We're not deciding how it happened, when it happened, where it happened, or if it was real. Our job is simply to believe them. One way to do that is by asking open-ended questions. We're probably all familiar with this idea, but an open-ended question is basically asking a question that requires more than a yes or no response, saying, can you tell me more about that? Can you tell me what it's like for you to be feeling this? Instead of saying, does it hurt? It's important when you're doing this that we avoid letting our own emotional responses interfere. This conversation is about them, not about us. It's not the time to tell our long-winded stories about when we went through the same thing unless they ask for it. And if we have an experience that's similar that may be helpful, we can ask them if they'd like to hear it. But it's not about us, it's about them. It's important during this time to remember, as you're listening non-judgmentally, it's important to remember that it's not your job to fix it. It's not your job to take away their pain. In fact, you can't. It is your job to sit with them in it. There's a lovely author and podcaster named Glennon Doyle, who in one of her books, it's about parenting, but I think this is applicable here, talks about how as people, we cannot protect the people we love from pain. We cannot tell them, I'm never going to let you experience hardship. You're never going to hurt. Our job as people who support others in their times of pain is to look them in the eyes, to say, this is going to hurt, to hold their hands and to walk through the pain with them. It's not to fix it. It's not to take it on with them. It's to be with them during the experience. The K in talks is to keep supporting them, keep checking back in. This is not a one and done conversation. If someone chooses to bare their soul to you, ask them how the best way to follow up may be. And then the S at the very end is safety first. And by what I mean by that is ask people how they're doing for real. Ask them if they're having any thoughts of hurting themselves or hurting someone else. There's a great misconception that if we say the word suicide, if we say the word self-harm, if we say the word drinking until you're numb, that people are more likely to do it. And that is just not true. In fact, all of the research would support that when we name the scary parts out loud, people are more likely to trust us and to ask us for help if they are experiencing any of those things. So my deep ask of you is to ask the hard questions, listen carefully and non-judgmentally as people give you their answers. I'm going to check the chat again really fast. Yeah, it's Sharon. I'm so sorry. That's so hard. And I'm glad that you're there to ask the hard questions of them. We are going to move on to what to do when you are the person who may have experienced this trauma. And the first thing I want you to remember is that the goal for us as people who may have experienced who may be experiencing distress related to trauma is not to not feel the distress. Our goal is not to not be sad anymore. Our goal is not to numb the feeling away, at least not in the long term. Because if we do that, it'll come back. No feeling stays gone forever if we don't feel it through to the end. The goal is feeling our emotions safely until the distress reduces. And in order to do that, we have to give ourselves time to feel and think about what we're feeling. Avoidance works really, really, really well until it doesn't, and then it doesn't work at all. It's important to remember who you are. Remember what you like to do. Remember what relationships are important to you. Do things that make you feel like yourself. Be around people who love you for who you are. And if you don't have those people, we need to figure out how to get you those people. And then there's lots of emotion regulation skills that you can use. And one of the handouts I think is available for download on Whova, and will go out after this in an email in a couple of days, is all about emotion regulation skills. There's 20 of them on there or something like that. But I'm going to go through a couple of them now. When we are feeling significant distress, when we feel ourselves stuck in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, when our sympathetic nervous system is activated and our parasympathetic nervous system has not yet kicked in, and we're trying to get it to kick in, some things that can support it starting up and helping us feel more regulated are moving your body. I don't mean going for a run, unless going for a run is your thing. I mean gentle movement, going for a walk, rolling around on the floor like a cat, having a dance party in your kitchen. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be official. You don't have to go to a gym. Simply the act of moving your body, ideally getting your heart rate going if you can from physical exertion, not anxiety, will help kick that parasympathetic nervous system into action. But any movement is going to be helpful in regulating. Very practically, moving heavy things can sometimes kick our parasympathetic nervous system into action. So that could be like pushing a chair across a room, moving a couch, doing hard work, physical work, diaphragmatic breathing, which is breathing that starts in your belly and you use your whole body for it, can be a really good way to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, with a word of caution that for some people, especially people who have experienced big T traumas, deep breathing exercises can be really unsettling and sometimes even panic inducing. And so I would encourage those folks to start with other activities first. Crying is a great way to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, even if it's kind of unpleasant in the moment. Sleeping, if that's available for you, taking a nap, going outside, literally touching grass can be a good way to activate your parasympathetic nervous system. Eating something, shaking, I think, is an interesting but helpful way to activate your parasympathetic nervous system. When I worked with kids for a long time years ago, we would call it getting rid of the ickies, or like flicking the icks out. And so literally shaking I'm just shaking my hands right now, but if I were in my office with a client, we would be shaking our whole bodies. Talking about your experience with somebody who can listen empathetically, mindfulness and meditation, among which I would include prayer. Can be a great way to feel more peace in our bodies. And then last but not least, there's an activity called progressive muscle relaxation, which you can find everywhere online. But basically it's tensing and then releasing the muscles in your body, usually starting with your feet and ending with your head, progressively throughout your body in an effort to activate your parasympathetic nervous system. I'm going to check the chat. Yes. Painting. Yes, Michelle. And yes, a copy of the slides should be on the Whova platform, Pat. And if not, will be emailed out. If not. And additionally, will be emailed out when Havala is emailing people in the coming days. Woodworking is a lovely coping technique, Mark. Yeah, I would love to hear yours. If you guys want to pop them in the chat, I'd love to hear what works well for you when you're experiencing distress, something that helps you feel like yourself, that can help you become more regulated in a period of dysregulation. Quilting, crafting, creating. I love these examples. I think especially for things that are creative and use our hands, there's some evidence, they're using both sides of our brains, right? So, and there's some really good evidence for bilateral brain stimulation, playing music, listening to music, knitting, crocheting. But when you have that bilateral brain stimulation, you're using both sides of your brain at the same time, you can have a very, very calming effect on your body and activate your parasympathetic nervous system. Putting the brakes on. Yes, petting your dog or your cat. Absolutely, which I would suggest is both a loving and a sensory experience. And those sensory experiences can be really, really handy when we're trying to regulate ourselves. I'm going to close where I can see the chat again. I would like to see where we are on the slides. Okay, actually, before we go here, I'm going to hop back. I'd like to talk a little bit about when church isn't enough. I'm a therapist. I love therapy. I've been in therapy. I do therapy all day long with my clients. I think therapy is a great thing. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what therapy looks like and how to find a therapist. Because for some of us who have experienced the trauma of disaffiliation, we can be okay with some parasympathetic nervous system activation and some emotion regulation skills and talking to trusted friends and loved ones. And for some of us, if we're experiencing the stress that feels unmanageable, or if it's affecting our lives in ways that feel kind of scary or life interfering, therapy is a great idea. So here's how to find a therapist. The first thing I want you to do is know that on the conference website, there's a compiled list of therapists who are affiliated in some way with the United Methodist Church. These are people who know enough about this season of disaffiliation in the United Methodist Church that you wouldn't feel like you had to teach your therapist about the bad thing that happened to you before they understand. Okay, I encourage you to start there if you're looking for a therapist for yourself. There's also a lot of really great websites online, therapy directories like Therapy Den, probably the big guy is Psychology Today, that have directories and can tell you about therapists in an area where you may live. So what I would want you to do if you were looking for a therapist for yourself or for someone else, for someone you love, is to identify 3 people who may be a good fit. And then you call them or you email them or you send them a message on their website and you say, in addition to yourself, this is also a handout that's written down for you, so you don't have to jot it down if you don't want to. You say, in addition to yourself, who do you recommend for treating whatever the issue is? So in this case, if we're talking about the trauma of disaffiliation, I may say, in addition to yourself, who do you recommend for treating spiritual distress secondary to a really traumatic relational rupture? Or if you may also ask, if you were seeking help for this for a loved one, who would be your first call? If you call or email or interact with 3 therapists and you ask them those questions, they're going to give you a list of names, and probably a couple of names will rise to the top. Those people whose names rise to the top, the cream, if you will, that's who you call first. Okay, those are the people who may have the most expertise and knowledge in what you're trying to get help for. Another thing I want you to know about seeking therapy for yourself is that many, many, many therapists offer a free consultation, which would usually be a 15 to 20-minute phone call where you can ask them your questions and they can answer them for you. And you can ask them, and they can ask you questions as well to see if you would be a good fit. The most important indicator for success in therapy, if success is defined as meeting your goals for therapy, feeling better when you finish therapy than you did when you start, is goodness of fit with a therapist. It matters that your therapist gets who you are and that you understand who they are and that you like each other at least most of the time. I always encourage people to ask the potential therapist if they participate in any ongoing supervision or consultation, which would mean meeting with their colleagues to ensure that they're following best practices. And if they do, it's likely a sign that they take their work seriously, and they ought to take their work seriously. It's serious work. And then last but not least, and this like hot tips for finding a therapist, is I want you to remember that finding a therapist can take some time. Sometimes it's okay to go to one session, decide this isn't the person for you, and go somewhere else. And ideally, you can even talk to the therapist you've met with about who might be a better fit. Yes. And Chris has a great point. If you are going to use your insurance for therapy, make sure during that consultation call, you confirm that they can take your insurance. And I will add as an aside, in order for therapists to bill insurance, we have to give a diagnosis, which is A-okay. There's nothing wrong with having a mental health diagnosis. And if you work unfortunately, there are still some careers and fields where that can cause some difficulty. So sometimes if people have like a security clearance or something like that, and they're concerned that having a diagnosis could affect that, they may not want to use their insurance for treatment. And there are a lot of really lovely sliding scale options for therapy. My personal favorite resource is Open Path Collective, which is a group of therapists who commit to taking on a number of sliding scale clients as part of their work. Okay, so let's talk about trauma-informed churches. The SAMHSA, which is a national federal organization for the treatment of mental illness, created 6 key principles of being trauma informed. And then the North Carolina Council of Churches actually did a really lovely job taking those 6 principles and applying them to churches specifically. And so that's what you see on the screen now. I'm going to go through them briefly. And then we'll talk very practically about what these bigger concepts look like in our individual congregations. Pop into the chat really fast. Thanks, John, for putting Open Path up there. Okay, so trauma-informed churches, safe churches, churches that are safe for people who have experienced any kind of trauma, to include the trauma of disaffiliation, are places that are safe. They're places that have physical safety. That means that we pay attention to the physical church plant. It means that if the carpet has staples sticking out of it, we push them back in. It means that if the steps are wobbly or unsafe, we fix them. It means that there's also emotional and relational safety, that we pay attention to that we pay attention to personal boundaries that people may set. So one example of that may be if somebody, when you're greeting people, if your practice is to shake hands, maybe confirming that it's okay with somebody that they have physical contact before you shake their hand. Asking somebody what their preferred greeting might be would be a way to ensure physical safety. We'll get into more practical ideas soon. Trustworthiness and transparency. That's basically, are you telling the truth about who you are in an open and transparent way? Are authenticity and vulnerability valued within your community of faith? Our confidence is kept. Is confidentiality kept by the people in leadership? Does unintentional sharing of information happen, even with good intentions? We've all been a part of a church community before where the prayer chain starts to turn into the gossip chain. That is not a trauma-informed approach. And we got to stop it. We can do better. The third kind of criteria of a trauma-informed church would be mutual support, which is the idea of going beyond being friendly and supporting the creation of genuine connections, genuine relationships and friendships. Is there shared relational vulnerability? Where can a person seeking help, where can they seek help without having repercussions from systems in power? Can that happen both in large group and in small group settings? Are ministry leaders modeling self-care in their own practices? Are they in community with other leaders, or are they isolated? I would suggest that isolated leaders are dangerous. Collaboration and mutuality would be having a culture of learning and growth. Does the church prioritize listening and being with those who have been deeply hurt? Empowerment, voice, choice is the idea that everyone who is in community, in this church, in this community of faith, is given the opportunity to share, to teach. Is there an understanding that people with lived experiences of trauma, people who have experienced trauma, bring value and wisdom to the community? Are all people in the faith community fully integrated into the life of the church and given a voice for self-advocacy? So that would mean not assuming what the kids like or what the kids need or what the kids want, but asking the kids. That would mean not assuming what the children or the young families need. It would mean asking them. It would mean not assuming what the homebound members need, but asking them instead how they can be most fully integrated into the life of the church. And then finally, number 6, in these principles of safe trauma-informed churches is the idea of cultural, historical, and self-identity. Do you know who you are? Do you recognize that cultural issues are often bound up in trauma? Do you recognize the ways that our churches have often been responsible for perpetuating harm? Some examples of that could be the systems that we need to recognize as important in the lives of the members of our congregation. Could be, do we recognize the way that gender impacts somebody's experience, that race or nationality impacts their experience in the world? And then is there room in your faith community for multiple expressions of faith? Even if we have core central beliefs, do we recognize the validity that people may do those beliefs, may practice those things in different ways that honor their own cultural and historical backgrounds? So I think all of this is important, but what's really important to you, and I know this, is, okay, Carrie, so like, what does that actually look like? In our churches, what does it look like to be a safe and welcoming and trauma-informed community? The most important thing that you can do to have a safe, trauma-informed community in a season of disaffiliation, or I would argue pretty much any season, is to talk about it. That S in talks. Say the hard parts out loud. If you're having a hard time, you're almost certainly not the only one having a hard time. Tell the truth about your experience. Tell the truth about your story. Use feeling words. Use words like hope and shame and sadness and loneliness and betrayal and bitterness. Because when we use those words as faithful Christians, as people who live into the wholeness of a loving God, we take some of the stigma of feeling that way away. I think we are all familiar with faith communities and people whose experience of Christian faith is that Christians don't feel those things. Christians aren't sad. Christians don't feel shame or guilt or disappointment. And friends, I tell you, that is just not true. Christians feel all of those things and more because we are whole people who have a whole experience of emotion. And the more we can talk about those in our faith communities, the more honest other people are going to be about their experiences as well. It's so important that we don't stigmatize having trouble. It's so important that we don't stigmatize suffering. I think it's really important, very practically, that we are extremely clear about what our church believes. In the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church, we have created lighthouse churches, which I think is lovely. I'm so glad that we have this idea of lighthouse churches to be people in faith communities who are committed to remaining United Methodist. I would love for us to go farther. I would love for us to have on each and every United Methodist Church website in the Western North Carolina Conference a clear statement of belief. This is what the people in this church believe, specifically around things like gender identity, sexuality, because those are things that are, big deals in our current season of disaffiliation. And people want to know. They shouldn't have to call the church or wonder when they're going into it. What they're walking into. And like for many of us, our churches don't have one clear, unified belief. And so say on your website that there are affirming Christians in our congregation, and there are also people who are non-affirming. We don't have to talk ourselves up and make ourselves look one way or the other. We just need to tell the truth. In the words of the great Brene Brown, clear is kind. Clear is kind. Clarity matters here. Say what you believe. Okay. The next thing I want you to know that can help support practically a trauma-informed church community is looking critically around your worship spaces, your activities, your language. Notice if things might be hard for somebody with trauma. Do you have flashing lights? Do you have extremely loud music that kicks on without any warning or notice? Do people kind of de facto hug new people in your congregation? All of those things may not feel safe for somebody who's experienced trauma. I don't know if any of you have ever visited a church for the first time and experienced the phenomenon where in so many churches you're either like ignored or you're swarmed, right? Where like immediately 15 people are around you and saying, "Hi, who are you? What are you doing here? I'm glad you're here. Would you like to come to Sunday school? We're having breakfast after this." That's incredibly overwhelming for people who haven't experienced trauma, and maybe even more so for people who have. And so I encourage churches to think really clearly about how we greet, how we interact with people who may be new to our congregations. They need to be greeted, but it needs to be warm and welcoming and not overwhelming. We want to make sure that churches are physically accessible to people who have differences in mobility, have safe ways to enter our churches and interact and worship. Is the signage in our churches clear? Is the way to get to the place where worship is held, to the restrooms, to the kitchen, to the water fountains, to coffee if you have it, are those things clearly marked? These are the things that make going into a new church, especially if you've experienced trauma in a church previously, especially difficult. We need to just make it as simple and clear to understand as possible. Okay, exactly where things are. This one's hard. In our churches, we have to remember that each and every person there, and not just remember, but be explicit about saying out loud that each and every person there is a beloved child of God, whether or not we agree with them. We have to leave room for and even celebrate loving disagreement. It's great when we all get along, But man, isn't there something so remarkably holy about being able to say, you know, Kristen and I, we don't see eye to eye on everything, but we agree that God loves you. We agree that God's here. We agree that serving God is the most important thing in our life. We have to leave room and celebrate the loving disagreement. We have to name the things we don't agree on and acknowledge that we can love each other regardless. It's hard. It takes practice. None of us are going to get it right the first time. Probably none of us are going to get it right the 20th time, but we're going to keep trying and keep practicing because we're slowly moving on towards perfection. I want you to encourage and normalize therapy as a church. I like to think of the ethics of this, especially for people in leadership in churches and pastors, that I really feel it's critical that every single pastor have a list of people they can comfortably refer to, therapists in their community who they know, who they've at least had a phone conversation with, who they know what they specialize in, what they treat, who they can refer people to. And that pastors know what is in their lane and what is outside of their lane. As a rule of thumb, if you are a clergy person and someone has come to your office 3 times or more about the same issue, and it's not directly related to their faith, it includes other things, or is manifesting in physical or emotional or relational symptoms that are interfering with their life, please refer out. You can keep working with them. Some therapists will work conjointly with them. But most pastors, not all, but most pastors who are ordained in the United Methodist Church are not qualified to do therapy. I think it's really important that in our churches, we foster opportunities for church and community remembrance, reflection, and lament. This could look like a service letting people who have left the church go. Maybe we invite them, maybe we don't, but we pray for their absence. We pray that they find places where they can be in community and feel right. I think that having ritual around endings, ritual around our remembrance, our reflection, and our lament is really, really important. We have to talk about the hard things. We have to talk about the stuff that feels scary. I think that when I can get pastors to preach about this stuff from the pulpit, I'm the happiest person on earth. Develop one very trauma-informed practice that we can do in our churches is to preach about the hard stuff, to develop sermon and teaching series that incorporate coping practices that acknowledge the reality of pain as part of a Christian experience. I really encourage people in leadership in the church to consider taking a class like mental health first aid, and maybe John can pop a link for that in the chat as well. I'll also brag on him a little bit. John is a mental health first aid instructor, and so he can get you hooked up with trainings that are offered in mental health first aid. But mental health first aid is basically like Red Cross first aid, as a class, but instead of how to stop the bleeding and how to do CPR, it's how to respond to a psychiatric or mental health emergency. And I think that having people in our churches who can recognize signs of a mental health emergency and then who can do everything they can to stop the metaphorical bleeding and get people into places where they can find healing and safety is really, really important. Offering space for prioritizing staff and leadership self-care is a best practice for being a trauma-informed church. That might mean encouraging your staff and your leaders to take time out of their workday to be in a mentoring or accountability group, a consultation group with other professionals. It might mean acknowledging that they can only meet 1 or 2 nights of the week because they need to be in relationship with their families the other nights. It might mean saying, we're going to pay your copays for therapy because we have the money to do that. It could mean a lot of things. It can mean paying for spiritual direction, but encouraging that self-care for the people in leadership in your church, not just clergy, but all people in leadership in your church is really important. And when I say self-care, let me specify, I do not mean bubble baths. I do not necessarily mean massages, although those are lovely. I do not mean a manicure or a pedicure, although those are also lovely. I mean things that make you feel like yourself and can help regulate your nervous system. And then last but not least, in a trauma-informed church, we stay in our lane. We refer. We give people resources external to the church when necessary, so that they can get the help and the healing that they need and remain engaged members in our communities. I don't have this written anywhere, but I will tell you that in the United Methodist Church in the Western Conference, we have a relationship with a therapy practice called Sanctuary Counseling Group that has all therapists who all have some level of familiarity with Christianity in general, and oftentimes with the United Methodist Church. So they might be a good place to start your search if you are looking for therapy for you or someone you love. I'm gonna check the chat really quickly. Yes, mental health first aid is so lovely. And oh, Chris, that's wonderful. I didn't realize that our book of worship has a liturgy for saying goodbye to members. What a lovely opportunity for healthy closure that could offer. Thanks for putting that in the chat, John. Mark, I don't know if the Chrysalis Center is still active. That's a great question. I will find out. I'm going to write it down. I'll find out. So we have a little bit of time left. I tried really hard to finish with enough time to answer any questions that you guys may have. So if anything has come up for you, feel free. Oh, thank you, Glenda. I appreciate that. Okay, yeah, let's see if we can answer some questions. So Chris says, what might it look like to walk a congregation through healing from a cumulative trauma? I've offered opportunity for lament, personal repentance, healing, one-on-one conversation. They're still hurting. Oh, Chris, this is such a hard one. It sounds like you're doing the things. And the words of Glennon Doyle come back to mind, that so often when we are working with people who have experienced trauma, we can't fix it. It has to resolve in its own time, and that's different for all of us. And so the thing we can do is continue naming it, continue offering space for grief and for hurt and for sadness, and to remind them that they're not alone and that we are with them in it. But gosh, I wish there were a clear-cut answer. I think that the reality of healing from trauma collectively and congregationally is that it takes a long time. And frankly, we're still in the middle of it. And maybe that's the other thing I want to acknowledge, is that healing from trauma really can't start until the trauma's over. If somebody is experiencing the trauma of divorce, for example, a traumatic divorce, we can offer support and love through the divorce, but we can't start processing and healing from the symptoms and the symptoms of trauma until the threat has passed. It would be like trying to activate our parasympathetic nervous system and find healing while the saber-toothed tiger is still chasing us. And you're right, Chris. I think it is going to be hard all over again. I think that we have a unique privilege to be the host of General Conference, and it's also going to open up a lot of scabbed wounds, if you will. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, guys, I'm very, very grateful for our time together. My email is up on the screen. I have a website that you can contact me through. And like the real elder millennial that I am, I'm fairly active professionally on Instagram and pop up over there from time to time with ideas about coping skills and ways to process. Specifically over there, I talk a lot about generational trauma, but really, what is spiritual trauma if not generational trauma? So you're welcome to find me over there as well. I really appreciate all of your time and your commitment to saying the hard parts out loud. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely evening. We're going to get out a little bit earlier so we can like go to bed. Thanks, everyone.